Hello and good morning. It's amazing as a preacher how you start to write a sermon and then you see or hear something and it makes you think, and then you totally change the sermon that you've already written. And I tell you now that this is one of the ways you know the Holy Spirit is working through you. So, I have been listening to a song by King and Country called God Only Knows. I always like to look at the reasons why a worship song has been written and the songs have been created. This is what the band said about why they wrote God Only Knows. The band reflects, "We've walked with those we love as they've battled through loneliness. We've heard your stories of great loss, and lately we've seen several in the public eye take their own lives. In turn, we were compelled to write and portray an honest, yet hopeful, song for us all during difficult seasons." For King and Country recently took to social media to raise awareness of a few causes close to their heart, including human trafficking and suicide prevention. The response that they got since this has been overwhelming, and fans from all over the world have left comments describing their own experiences with depression and anxiety, crediting God Only Knows for helping them through some of the toughest times in their life. So, as you can probably gather, the theme of today is anxiety, loneliness, and how we come through these times. As we are aware, anxiety and depression is such a tough illness to cope with, if people do actually cope at all. I always like to find out the facts and the figures behind things. So I looked at the MHFA England website and I found these two statistics. 1 in 4 people experience mental health issues each year. 792 million people are affected by mental health issues worldwide. 792 million people. These figures are huge, but they don't include anything that has come out of this coronavirus pandemic. These figures were as of January in 2020, so before the pandemic came about. People have been feeling isolated and anxious about the future during this pandemic and worrying whether they would ever see their families again. This is how Peter and the disciples are feeling in the same passage. The anxiety level among Jesus' disciples had just reached an all-time high. And we're looking at John 14, verses 1 to 14. If we look to the verses before the passage, we see that Jesus had just shared with them the news that had threatened to ruin their future plans. "My children," Jesus had said, "I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now. Where I am going, you cannot come." And that's from John chapter 13, verse 34. I want us to all remember that we are children of God. It's a very important thing to remember. So looking back at our reading, we hear God calling us my children. Imagine a parent telling a child that he or she is leaving and that where they are going, that child cannot come. Think about the stories you've heard in the newspaper about the nurses and the care workers and the workers that have had to work all the way through the coronavirus. There have been stories where the workers have had to leave their household and live in their tent in their garage, or they've had to leave their house and live at somebody else's house because they might bring home that virus, and the last thing they want to do is to give it to their children and their spouses. How hard would that be if you knew that you had to tell your child that for 12 weeks you were going to be living somewhere else, that they couldn't see you, that they couldn't hug you? The only thing that they could do is to talk to you over Skype or FaceTime or Zoom. Imagine how anxious that would make a child and the adults. The anxiety of that child would feel is like the anxiety that the disciples felt when they heard these words from the Master. After Jesus lets them know this, are they able to hear anything else? I mean, Jesus has just given them such a huge bombshell. How are they going to get any further? How are they going to be able to move further than with themselves? Jesus goes on to say, "A new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Peter's response shows that he hadn't heard a word Jesus had said about loving one another. Have you ever been told something and then totally not been able to believe it? So much that then anything after what they've said is a complete blur. It brings me to the adverts that you see, but I think they're Macmillan Cancer Trust, where the consultant tells the person that they've got cancer. And everything after that statement is a complete and utter blur for the person. That's the kind of shock news that you can imagine would give the disciples the same kind of response. They have been told that the person they care about, that the person they're following, that has helped them through everything, is suddenly going to vanish. They're never going to see him again, and they can't go where he is going. I mean, that is something that is very big and is very hard to take in. Everything had stopped for Peter when Jesus said, "I will be with you only a little longer." And Peter asks, "Lord, where are you going?" When we understand the backstory in which these words of chapter 14 were spoken, we are amazed. Jesus is the one who is facing arrest and the physical abuse and the humiliation that follows. His disciples have been told this several times. Jesus is the one who is headed for the suffering of the cross. He is the one who could have used comfort and assurance, but instead he offers comfort to his disciples and tells them of the future that he has planned for us. These words of Jesus also apply to you and me. As I studied the verses of chapter 14 of John, it seemed that Jesus was telling us some very important things. He tells us where we're going, how we get there, and the life that he intends for us in the meantime. But he also tells us some other things that I think are very important. And the first thing that I want us to think about is that Jesus is telling us that we need not be anxious. Now, I know that this is something that is not easy to do. I know all too well how hard it is not to be anxious. But even more important is that he then comforts us. We all start to feel better when we have someone to comfort us. Sometimes it can feel like there is no one there for us. Sometimes it can feel like there is no one listening to us. And sometimes it can feel like we are totally alone. And being socially distanced and in lockdown doesn't help that situation one bit. But this is where the passage comes into its own. Jesus is telling us that we do not need to feel alone, because we are not alone. Even when we are actually physically alone, and there's no one else in our houses, there's no one else to be seen, we are never emotionally and spiritually alone, because Jesus is always here for us, next to us, with us, and deep in our souls. So this is where we come to the next point of the passage. For us not to feel anxious, we need to trust. And trust is a tricky thing to grasp for everyone, especially if we feel like someone has betrayed our trust in the past. The passage says, "Don't you know me, Philip, even after I have been among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show me the Father'?" He is wondering why the disciples didn't believe him. He is wondering why the disciples didn't trust him. All he wants to do is to comfort us and for us to trust that even though he is going away, that he will still be there for us, and more importantly, that he will be back. Makes me think about the song Trust and Obey. I'll just read a few lines from it for you. When we walk with the Lord in the light of his word, what a glory he sheds on our way. While we do his good will, he abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Not a shadow can rise, not a cloud in the skies, but his smile quickly drives it away. Not a doubt or a fear, not a sigh or a tear, can abide while we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. All Jesus wants us to do is to not be anxious, to trust him and have faith. And the having faith is the next stage of where I want to take us. Verse 11 shows that faith helps us to trust. Faith helps us not to be anxious. Verse 11 says this: "Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe in the evidence of the works themselves." He wants us to have faith. He wants us to believe and to understand that he is the way and the truth of life. That's all hope and truth comes through him. He loves us so much that he is willing to go through death on a cross to save us from ourselves and from our sin. Now, I lost my faith, or I lost my way with my faith when I was 18 due to something that happened to me. But what is important is that I came through my depression by finding my faith again. It's a very key and very important part of my life. And since then, my faith has been so strong. And the reason my faith has been so strong is because I have gone backwards. Going backwards from this, my faith made me able to trust. And by trusting in God, I have been able to work through my depression and my anxiety. And this is what I wanted to show you today: the importance that Jesus has in this world. So, verse 12 says this: "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works that I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. When we have the Spirit of God, when we act like the child that God has made us to be, when we have faith, we come through our anxiety. We learn to trust, and we learn to have faith in the one who comforts us. And this leads us on to the fourth thing. This is where we find peace. And through our works and the works of the Spirit, we can help the world to see the goodness that Jesus brings. With our faith and the trust that we have between us, we can work together with that Spirit to achieve great things. We can help the world achieve peace. We can help the world achieve equality. We can help the world achieve peace and love and equality and true happiness. So there it is. God helps us not to be anxious. God helps us to trust. And with God's help, we can find faith beyond all compare. And with God's help, we can help the world to see the light and to help the world bring harmony and peace to itself. The passage ends full circle. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. Here he is comforting us once again, back where we started at the beginning of chapter 14. It's amazing how you can read through 14 verses and start and end in the same place. So what's important? How would I sum up verses 1 to 14 of John chapter 14? Don't be anxious. Trust in the Lord. Have faith in the Lord. And find peace and love. And those four things go in that order, and then they link back to him itself, because then we end with God comforting us, which leads us not to be anxious, which leads us to trust, to faith, and to peace. An endless circle. So thank you for listening. I hope that this has brought a little different perspective on the John 14 passage. And thanks for listening. Goodbye.